Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience and then my interpretation of the markets around the world, but then bringing it more localised into the Latam market. I'm trying some new technology here, so... No. Have we got my presentation loaded up? So, in case you haven't realised, I'm from Australia. Has anyone been to Australia before? There's a few of you out there. Well, do yourself a favour if you haven't been there, get to Australia. But one thing you need to know about Australians, we're very blunt. We don't believe in political correctness. So this presentation, I apologise in advance if I offend anyone. But no, I don't think this is working. We might have to revert to the other method. We seem to be skipping presentations. So can we go to the next slide? And again. So Australia, keep going. So this is my background. I started off at KPMG, chartered accountant, then I went into banking, went into property development and retirement villages and student accommodation. I'm telling you this for some context later. Then went to Transit Systems in Australia, which is one of the top 3 public transport companies in Australia. Recently won a 600 bus contract in Sydney, in inner Sydney, running that for the New South Wales government. In 2013, branched out with a spin-off company called Tower Transit, which bought First Group's London bus operation, or part of it. And I, at that time, relocated to the UK in London. I've been running that business ever since, and I'll tell you in the following slides a little bit more about what we've done at Tower Transit, and then hot off the press, about to break away with a new business called Ascendal, which will be focusing on the Americas. So if I can move on. So Tower Transit, 2013, we went into the London bus market, which I think is fair to say is one of the most advanced, possibly benchmark for the world when it comes to running buses. And this presentation is going to be about buses specifically, but I'm going to do a higher level principles talk that applies to public transport in general. We then, on the back of the performance in London, won a contract in Singapore in 2015 to be the first company that was non-Singaporean to enter that market under a 400 bus contract with the Singapore government. That was a really exciting opportunity to partner with the government, a genuine partnership to bring massive reform to their industry, and specifically to their bus industry. So if we can move on. And what we discovered as part of this journey, we made it a very intentional effort to take the industry away from being about big buses and infrastructure and bringing it into being about people. You know, at the end of the day, what do we do as bus operators? We move people. And I think we can often forget that. At the heart of our business, it's about improving people's lives. So it's all about the staff that work for us. It's all about the people we move in the city. And we did that in Singapore. The focus was very much about how we can make the city work better, how we can take an industry that was, at that point in time, not thought of very highly. Not many people wanted to work in the bus industry in Singapore. Certainly if you went to university, you didn't want to tell your parents you're now driving a bus. And we transformed that into an industry where people wanted to be a part of. For 1,000 jobs, we had 10,000 applications. That was the government's biggest concern, that was the process would fall over. And we did that through this connection with the community, that the bus service was theirs and they owned it and they were a part of it. And you can see the pride in the bus captains, they call them in Singapore, and the uniforms that we created, which we invited the community to be a part of. Next one. And you know, we try not to be boring. We try to engage with the community in a way that's not traditional, because I think our industry is a little bit too boring, if I was to be honest. Next slide. On the back of our performance in Singapore, which I must admit was highly scrutinised by the press, by the public at large, because it was the first time they'd trusted their system to a non-Singaporean company, I'm glad to report we exceeded expectations, and the industry has significantly improved, not just because of us, but because of what this new fresh competition brought to the market. And the two incumbent operators, both Singaporean, and now there's a fourth operator as well, they've all lifted their game because as an industry, they are now very competitive, and overall the game has lifted, which has meant the city itself has improved. More people are interested in public transport and using it and relying on it. So on the back of that, we won British International Company of the Year last year. We also won a number of awards in Singapore, including this one for workplace culture and engagement, which included the who's who of international companies: McDonald's, FedEx, Bloomberg, Changi Airport, and little old Tower Transit no one had heard of, and we scooped the award. Thank you. So Tower Transit in London, we've been trialling a lot of new technology, new innovations. We've been running hydrogen buses with Transport for London and the European Union for 8 years. We've got all the latest trials with virtual electric charging under the bus stops. So we're agnostic to technology. We like to look at it on its merits and determine what suits what cities best. Next, thanks. We were the major sponsor of the Zero Emissions Conference in London last year. And again, please. We're doing creative things like bringing sense onto buses, trying to see what new thinking can bring to our somewhat old industry. And again, better communication with passengers, with staff. We're developing apps. We're working with tech companies like Citymapper, which is the next one, where they're just trialling some pop-up buses in London, using their data to try to better determine what gaps there are in the network. So we've been providing those services for Citymapper. And then in the future, again, there's many other things we've been working on. So we're trying to constantly be at the leading edge of technology and what's going on. Thank you. And for example, we're currently also trialling with Heathrow autonomous vehicles because they want to go fully autonomous. So that leads to the next slide. That was the context setter. Now, what am I going to talk about today? Thank you. I'm going to talk about some principles in our industry, because the context for the bus industry is we move significant amounts of people around the world on any given day. You look at the tube network in London, one of the best networks in the world. There's almost twice as many people catch a bus every year in London than catch the tube. But it's a kind of almost a forgotten part of public transport. Everyone talks about rail and other things, but actually the bus system is integral. And it's got some major problems. To be perfectly blunt with you, it's got some major problems. So I look at a city, pick any city, you put a bus network map on it. What does it remind you? It reminds me of the human body and the way the circulatory system works in a human body, the way blood moves around a body. If you're healthy, your blood's circulating. You don't notice it. I don't look at my blood daily, you don't either. But it's working, it's moving. If my blood stops running to my arm, I've got a problem with my arm. If it stops running to my heart, I've got a serious problem. I look at a bus system the same way. The city works. Cities have people moving around. They're the blood system. It needs to move to be a healthy city. I look at London and I think that's an amazing city. It's hugely successful. One of the hidden secrets is its transport network. I look at cities that are got some problems, and generally speaking, there's some major transport issues. Thank you. So what I like to do is if we could just stop that, please. Thank you. So I like to grade cities from a bus network structure perspective. So I'm looking at a high level. How is it structured? Because I think that's a key question that we kind of skip over. We talk about bringing new technologies in, we talk about all the different things we want to do, exciting things, but actually, step back, how is a city structured from a public transport perspective? And I put this on a target where on the one continuum you've got government and private. What do I mean by that? Well, there's plenty of bus systems in the world that are purely operated by governments. It doesn't really work very well. And there's plenty of systems in the world that are purely operated by private entities, and that doesn't really work very well. In my experience, it works best when there's a partnership happening. And then on the other continuum, I look from an unregulated to an exclusive perspective. There's plenty of examples of long-term contracts exclusive to one operator where there's no one else can come to the market or compete. That doesn't work very well. And in an unregulated environment, which is in the UK outside of London, where there's supposed to be pure competition, what generally happens is you have oligopolies form, and it's very hard to have competition, real competition, on the street. Whereas in the centre, you have competition for service, which tends to produce much better results, and also, if it's done well, you've got a partnership between private and government. So let's put some cities into this equation. And generally, right in the centre, you've got a good franchising model. So London, for example, it's a good mix between private and government, probably tilted a little bit towards the government side, and probably a little bit towards the exclusive because the operators own most of the depots and the buses. So it's very hard for new operators to actually enter the London market. If I could go to the next one, please. Singapore, after their recent reform, which we were intricately involved in, I would put them right almost in the centre. There's a good mix between government and private, and there's a good balance between asset ownership and operation. And Singapore actually travelled the world, went to over 20 countries looking at structures and what worked best to deliver public transport, because they had major issues in Singapore. When you have 70% of your population relying on public transport and it's not performing very well because you've got two operators that have become lazy and got a duopoly, then you need reform. And they picked actually London and the next one, thank you, Perth, as the two best examples in the world. Perth is the city where we first got our first contract in '96. So they then customised that and have an excellent model. But if I go a bit further, next one please. My Australian background, I look at Sydney and Brisbane. Both of those cities have inner areas operated by governments and outer areas operated by private enterprise. The inner areas are way off target. Major problems with efficiency and value for money. Next, thank you. But the outer areas are slightly different. Sydney, in the outer area, recently went through a reform similar to what I just explained in Singapore. Not quite as good as the way Singapore did it, but still very good. Brisbane, they have private operators, but they're basically grandfathered rights to have operations over many years. Next, thank you. UK ex-London, like I mentioned before, you don't have a competition because you've got oligopolies, but it's pretty much unregulated. But there's been reform put in recently to give the cities who are crying out to have more influence in their city powers like London do, and that's currently in motion. Thank you, next one. New York, very similar to Sydney, inner, and again, thank you. Hong Kong, like UK ex-London with some private operators, and again, thank you. And now let's start looking at Latin America. Santiago has gone through a recent tender process, but unfortunately cancelled recently and has pretty much got private operators that have a significant amount of control there, and the balance is a little bit out of whack. Thank you again. Sao Paulo, and again, Rio, very similar. Yes, there's tenders, but the current tender in Sao Paulo is a 20-year contract. Very hard for anyone to compete that's not already there. And again, please, Porto Alegre, more in the blue centre, and again, Buenos Aires, similar to Sao Paulo, and again, please. And then we come to Mexico, where the non-BRT, I know there's some reform, and forgive me, this is a principles talk, but I know there's some reform happening, but it's very much in the private area. But the BRT is promising with some good partnerships happening between government and private, and the way the BRT system is run here is really exciting, but perhaps not as open to that kind of regulated kind of opportunity for other entities. Okay, so now that there's the context of what I'm talking about with the cities and where you lock them into that. Now, why is that relevant? Let's go to the next slide, thanks. So, like I was talking, private government, if it's out of whack, if it's out of balance, if the government has too much control, what happens? Thank you. Okay, this is where I get politically incorrect. Unfortunately, governments are not particularly good at running businesses. So it's very much a dinosaur kind of mentality. Next one, thank you. There's a lack of innovation. Thank you. Laziness creeps into work practices, there's lack of efficiency, thank you, and there's generally a lot of wastage. And that's why government-run operations generally are not that effective. Next, thank you. And that leads to unhappy passengers. Okay, but what happens if it's tilted the other way? Private. Okay, what happens? We generally have monopolies created, and that leads to very rich, small number of people, or corporates. And again, thank you, who generally have massive political influence, way above the average person. Thank you. And that generally leads to laziness because there's no need to compete and you've got a market tied up. And again, thank you, which also leads to, well, I say wastage, but actually it means there's a small number of people benefiting at the expense of a large number of people. Thank you. And once again, unhappy passengers. And again, please. So let's step back a bit. My philosophy is that a government's job is to harness private greed for public good. Actually, if you're being brutally honest, private companies are motivated by profit. Now, you can put social justice and all these things into it, and yes, there's some good things that private companies do, but at the end of the day, they're motivated by profit. And if you want to change behaviour, you need to understand that. And you need to understand also in the context of cities and public transport is delivering far more benefits to a city than just fare box revenue from ticket sales. You look at the social welfare that's created, economic investment, reduction in costs of congestion and lost efficiency. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So where a government can see the greater value and put that into the equation and then align the interest of the private company to that greater good, that's where the magic happens. But unfortunately, in the vast majority of cities around the world, that magic ain't happening. So, next one. So, in my view, the way it should work is where there's a government that has that bigger picture view, that sets the rules that align the interest of the private sector to the public good. They set the rules, and again, thank you, they have that helicopter view of the city, of the network, and how things should work, because a private company will always maximise profit. They won't look to the cross-subsidised opportunities that may benefit the community at large, and really there should be more than one private company running a city. So it makes sense for the government to do those high-level issues. Next, thank you. And to then audit and make sure there's compliance with the rules that have been set, which is often a big failing with governments around the world where they've got the rules but they never enforce them. And then the final one is enforcing. And then, that may be fines or that may be taking a contract away. There's nothing more motivating as a private company than having the risk of having a contract taken away. Now, this structure actually means the private companies see the government as a client rather than as an impediment, which is often the view, that the government's just in the road of them doing a business. Now, if they see them as a client, that means all the things we're talking about, bringing reform in, new cleaner energy technology, new technology to help the customer, working together to get the city integrated between different modes. It's much easier under this structure because you have a client-supplier relationship where the supplier wants to work with the government to keep their business. If you don't have that structure, you end up in years and years and decades of negotiation and missed opportunity, which we've seen in many, many cities over and over again, which is why our industry is often very, very frustrating for people involved in it that want to see genuine reform. We'll go to the next section. And then on the private side, let's face it, private companies are good at bringing new ideas, new initiatives. We're listening or hearing a lot about those initiatives today. And again, thank you. Now, when you've got this structure, you've got companies that are fit and strong. Like I talked about in Singapore, when you had two companies that didn't really have competition, all of a sudden they had competition, they had to get fit, they had to go to the gym, they had to trim the belly so that they could compete with the new entrant. Next one, thank you. Yep. And then the focus is on getting A+ scorecards so that you can win more contracts and keep customers happy. And again, thank you. And you're always looking at reducing costs because that's one of the competitive angles that gives you an advantage that allows you to grow your business. And again, thank you. What does that mean? It means you've got an environment where operators are strengthening each other, which actually grows the whole market and benefits the whole community. Thank you. You've got a much more reliable service. That's a strange picture, but it's the clip when you go rock climbing. You want that to be working or you're dead. Next one. And you get gold star performance. And if you don't get gold star performance, you're getting audited and penalised. And again, and of course, overall, the value for money is much greater because costs are reduced and quality is improved. What does that lead to? Thank you. Happy passengers, happy community, a much more healthy city. Thank you. Okay, so what are the challenges for the Latam market? Because if you're, obviously a lot of you are familiar with this market, you're probably resonating with some of the things I've said. Thank you. Well, one of the biggest challenges is there's huge barriers to entry in Latam. For new entrants to come in with new ideas in the bus industry, it's very, very, very hard to break in. And we're experiencing that firsthand. I mean, this tender in Chile recently in Santiago, 600 bus tenders open to international players, just got cancelled, caught up in politics. Often I find in Latin America, you've got the sway being way over to the private sector, and you've got fairly weak governments, if I was to be honest, and politically incorrect. Next one, and you've got contracts that go from the time you're a baby to the time you're retiring. The length of some of these contracts just exclude innovation, exclude reform, exclude new ideas, because you've got control given for such an extended period of time. And so that just keeps the cycle going. You've got monopoly, you've got rich getting richer, you've got laziness, you've got political influence, and it goes around and around and around. How do we bust that? Thank you. We need some new thinking around this, because if we want to fast track the reform, and technology is coming at a speed that we haven't seen for probably 100 years, if not 1,000 years. If we want to embrace this as quickly as possible, we need some new ideas and new thinking around this. Thank you. So this is the breakaway that I was talking about with Ascendal. Our focus is very much on helping unlock cities' potential, and we see that in 4 areas, all linked to public transport, but all slightly different. Thank you. Mobility, obviously what I talked about. We need to get smarter with how structures are implemented in delivering bus services, like what Singapore did, where they came from a relatively lazy model with a lot of problems and unhappy customers to, in a short period of time, getting all the players up, their skills up, and the customers much, much happier with how things were going. But it's more than just that. Thank you. It's also from a property element. I think we need to get smarter from a property element. What do I mean by that? Historically, cities were created or formed through transport links. You put a rail line in, you created a new city. We've kind of lost the art of integrating transport with property and urban planning. And I know there's some great examples in the world, but there's not enough intentional thinking around this, where actually a city should be, its skeleton should be its mass transit system, and then we should do urban planning over the top of that. So we've got transit nodes that become the nodes of the city, where people can live, work, play, and move around freely, and the city will flow much better. And the next one, thank you. And then innovation and new ideas and technology should be into this mix as well. So we've got 2 industries. We've got this tech world, we've got this transport world that's been around a long time, got good infrastructure, understands transport. Then we've got this tech world that's coming from nowhere with all these great new ideas, but really doesn't have the history and understanding of this world. But these 2 worlds are colliding, and there's a lack of understanding between these 2 industries. And I think for everyone's benefit, we need to get that understanding connected. We need to have the 2 industries working together and in partnerships with governments, rather than all like this and a bit of a mess. And the 4th one is finance. I think there's really a lack of creative finance when it comes to public transport. And I think there's, I've got a finance background, I've got a number of bankers working for me, and we always look at this industry and think there's so much more opportunity to unlock things with a bit smarter thinking around finance. And so we've been working on a few things around that. But all these 4 areas are intricately linked to each other in public transport and unlocking the potential of a city. When they work together in a smart way with a city that really wants to bring change, that's when the magic can happen. So thank you. And that's when what I was just explaining, working together, and again, the real transformation occurs. Thank you. Okay, let me just give you one little quick example of one of those ideas. Thank you. And in my conclusion, so one of the things we've been talking about with a number of cities to help restructure the way public transport is delivered and rebalance things, it's really very much linked to finance, because at the moment, in Latam particularly, a lot of the assets, the buses, the depots, the information is owned by the private companies, which means it's very hard for governments to do the things we've talked about. Well, let me just continue with that thought. So what we've been working on is suggesting a structure where instead of the traditional model of putting out tenders for public transport over a long period of time, you put out a tender for a fund to own the infrastructure of the public transport, the buses, the depots, and that may be a long-term tenure that then has the ability to get finance against government risk rather than operator risk, procure buses on scale rather than the smaller, and it also allows the government then to put out tenders for much shorter periods with much more level playing field for the operators to come in and compete with each other on merits rather than historic advantage. And what does that mean? Well, that means there's a significant reduction in the cost of operating the service because of those 3 massive cost savings. And it also means that you can improve services significantly, like what I talked about in Singapore, because you have much more motivation. So the benefits, thank you, you get a much stronger government, which is a good thing when the government is then aligning objectives of the private sector with the public good. And again, thank you, you get a much stronger industry. And actually, I think it's small-minded to try to just protect your pie, when actually, if we all get stronger together, the pie can get much bigger and the city can work much better and there's much more opportunity. Thank you. The costs come down in those 3 areas. The Sao Paulo government that is currently putting out this 20-year tender, we talked to them a lot about this structure. We think we could have saved about 5 to 10 billion US over 10 years. Think of the impact that could have in that city if you could reinvest that into more services and better services and innovations. Much more reliable, and thank you. And again, gold star performance. And what does that all lead to? And again, thank you, happy customers. So I'm going to leave you with that thought. Thank you very much for listening. And last slide, thank you from Tower Transit, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.